On the day of the trip, everything seemed normal, except for Grandpa's silence sitting alone on the porch. Hours later at the airport, an inexplicable error forces the family to return home. But upon finding him again, they realize he knew, something no one imagined, and what happened next forever changed the place he occupied in that family. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll hear in your life. Thomas observed the movement through the window. His tired eyes registered every detail, the suitcases being placed in the trunk, the expectant smiles, the excitement taking over the family. Only he remained outside of that joy. The suitcase he had prepared the previous week rested on his bed, as useless as his hope of being part of the family's annual trip. At 78, Thomas Anderson carried on his face the marks of a lifetime dedicated to work and family. A widower for 5 years since Emily had passed after a long illness, he inhabited solitude with the quiet dignity that had always characterized his existence. The house where they had lived for decades now seemed too big for one man alone, but it was there that he kept all his memories. His son Edward, 52, was talking animatedly on the phone while carrying the last suitcase. His daughter-in-law, Mary, was checking if all documents were in order. His grandchildren, Philip, 22, and George, 15, were arguing about who would get the window seat on the plane. No one seemed to remember that Thomas existed. 3 days earlier, during Sunday dinner, Edward had communicated the news. "Dad, we're traveling to Orlando on Thursday. Unfortunately, we couldn't include you this time. You understand, right? Your age, the hotel stairs, the heat." Thomas merely nodded, swallowing not just the rice but also the humiliation. He didn't mention that weeks ago he had made all the reservations, as he had done for years. He didn't tell them that the tickets were in his name, that the accommodations were already paid for with his card, that the contact with the travel agency had been made through his old work colleague, Richard. He said none of this. He just smiled and wished them a good trip. That same night, after seeing the disregard with which he was excluded, he made a decision. He cancelled everything. Not out of revenge or anger, but out of dignity. He called Richard and asked him to cancel the reservations. He requested discretion. He didn't want confrontations, just respect. "Are you sure, Thomas?" Richard asked from the other end of the line. "I am, my friend. Don't worry, it's not resentment. It's just the recognition that my time in this family has passed." The conversation had been brief but decisive. Now, watching through the window, Thomas felt a strange peace. Something had broken, but there was no pain, only acceptance. The sound of a horn brought him back to the present. It was the taxi that would take the family to the airport. Edward looked at the house, and for a moment Thomas thought his son would come to call him, ask him to accompany them to the car to say goodbye. He didn't come. The car left, taking away the family and the last illusion of belonging that Thomas still nurtured. He walked slowly to the bedroom, opened the packed suitcase, and began to put each piece of clothing back in the closet. His wrinkled hands worked with precision, folding each shirt as Emily had taught him. When he finished, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the photograph on the bedside table. Him and Emily, young and smiling, with Edward still a child, in their arms. "You were right, Emily," he murmured to the smiling image of his wife. "We should have been firmer with him." At the airport, the Anderson family faced an unexpected problem. In the check-in line, Edward presented the documents and the reservation code, but the attendant, after typing the information into the system, shook her head negatively. "I'm sorry, Mr. Anderson, but there is no reservation in your name. In fact, it seems there was a cancellation 2 days ago." Edward frowned, confused. "That's impossible. My father confirmed everything last week." The mention of his father made Philip, the oldest grandson, look at his father uncomfortably. Something was wrong with this story. He knew that his grandfather always took care of the family trip reservations. It was a tradition. Why would this time be different? "There must be some mistake," insisted Edward. "Can we make new reservations now?" The attendant checked the system again. "I'm sorry, sir, but flights to Orlando are booked for the next 5 days, and the hotel where you would be staying also has no availability." Disappointment took over the family. Mary sighed, irritated. George muttered something about having wasted time packing his suitcase. Edward seemed genuinely confused. "Let's go home," he finally decided. "We'll try to understand what happened." On the way back, an uncomfortable silence filled the taxi. Philip looked out the window, thoughtful. He had noticed in recent months how his grandfather had been gradually pushed away from family decisions, how his presence seemed to bother them more and more. He even caught himself avoiding long conversations with Thomas, not out of disinterest, but from a strange feeling that he no longer knew how to connect with the elderly man. "Did anyone tell Grandpa we're coming back?" he suddenly asked. Edward looked at his son through the rearview mirror. No need. He must be at home as always. The response bothered Philip even more. As always sounded as if his grandfather were a piece of furniture, something fixed and lifeless, just taking up space. When they arrived home, they found Thomas sitting on the porch reading an old book. He seemed calm, as if he were waiting for them. "Back so soon," he commented without raising his eyes from the book. Edward quickly explained the situation at the airport, omitting the fact that the reservations had been cancelled, preferring to say there was an error in the system. Thomas just nodded, turning the page of the book. "That's a shame, maybe next time." Philip observed his grandfather carefully. There was something different about him, a serenity that seemed new. Or perhaps it had always been there and he had never really looked. "Grandpa, did you know the reservations were cancelled?" he asked directly. The silence that followed was revealing. Thomas slowly closed the book and faced his grandson with eyes that seemed to see far beyond the present moment. "Yes, Philip, I cancelled them." The confession hung in the air like a dense cloud. Edward stepped forward, incredulous. "You did what? Why?" Thomas didn't get upset. His voice remained calm, though firm. "Because you decided I wasn't going without even consulting me. The tickets were in my name, the accommodations were paid for with my card. I made all the reservations as I do every year. When I realized I was no longer welcome, I thought it better to cancel everything." The shock on Edward's face was evident. Mary looked away, embarrassed. George seemed confused. Only Philip kept his eyes fixed on his grandfather, a mixture of admiration and shame growing inside him. "Dad, it wasn't like that," Edward began, but Thomas raised his hand, interrupting him. "It's okay, son. There's no resentment. We just need to recognize the truth. I've become a burden to you, and that's okay. People change, families change." With these words, Thomas got up and walked into the house, leaving behind a family in silence, confronted for the first time with the consequence of their own disregard. Philip stood on the porch, watching the door through which his grandfather had disappeared. Something inside him had changed. The image of his grandfather, not as a fragile elderly man, but as a man of dignity and quiet strength, was etched in his mind. That night, as everyone ate dinner in an awkward silence, Philip made a decision. He would reclaim what the family had lost without realizing it. He would rediscover who Thomas Anderson really was before it was too late. The next day, Thomas woke up to the sound of the doorbell. When he opened the door, he found Philip standing there, holding a package. "Good morning, Grandpa. I brought cheese Danish, still warm." The simple, almost timid gesture caught Thomas by surprise. How long had it been since someone had thought to bring him something? How long since he had been remembered in the small things of daily life? "Come in, son," he said, feeling an unexpected emotion in his throat. "I'll make some coffee to go with it." As the water boiled, Philip observed his grandfather's impeccably organized kitchen. Thomas had always been methodical, a man of habits and routines. Emily's absence hadn't changed that. "Grandpa, I wanted to apologize for what happened yesterday." Thomas served coffee in 2 antique cups, the kind that were only used on special occasions. "There's nothing to apologize for, Philip. Life follows its natural course. The old give way to the young, that's how it should be." "No," Philip shook his head firmly. "That's not how it should be. You're not just an old man giving way to the young. You're our grandfather. You're part of our history." Thomas smiled, a tired but genuine smile. For a moment he remembered Emily. She would have liked to hear those words. In the weeks that followed, Philip began to visit his grandfather frequently, At first, they were short visits, marked by silences and superficial conversations. Gradually, however, the invisible barrier that separated them began to dissolve. Thomas started sharing stories from the past, memories of a life that Philip barely knew. "Your father was a restless boy," Thomas told him one Saturday afternoon while organizing old photographs. "Always with scraped knees, always running, always exploring. Your grandmother used to say he had energy for 3 children." Philip smiled, trying to imagine his father as a mischievous boy. It was difficult to reconcile that image with the serious and distant man he knew. "What changed him, Grandpa?" Thomas was silent for a moment, as if pondering the weight of that simple question. "Life, my son. Responsibilities, worries. Maybe I was too hard on him too. Your father grew up seeing a man who worked tirelessly to give the best to his family. Perhaps he learned the wrong lesson." During one of the visits, while Thomas was resting, Philip decided to help his grandfather organize some boxes in the attic. Among dust and memories, he found an old cassette tape recorder. Next to it, a box with several tapes organized by date. One of them, the last one, had a label with his grandmother's delicate handwriting, "For Edward and Thomas when I'm no longer here." Philip's heart raced. This seemed too important to ignore. Carefully, he brought the recorder and the tape downstairs. He gently woke his grandfather. "Grandpa, I found this in the attic. I think Grandma left a message for you and my dad." Thomas's eyes widened in recognition. "Where did you find this? I searched for months after your grandmother passed. I thought it was lost." With trembling hands, Thomas placed the tape in the recorder. He pressed the play button, and after a few seconds of static, Emily's voice filled the room, clear, firm, as if she was still there among them. "My dear Thomas, my son Edward, if you are listening to this, it means I am no longer there physically, but I want you to know that my love remains intact, eternal, as it always was." Philip observed the silent tears that ran down his grandfather's wrinkled face. "Thomas, my love, thank you for each day by your side. You were the best companion I could have asked for. Forgive the mistakes I made, the times I wasn't patient, the moments I didn't value your effort as I should have." Emily's voice trembled slightly before continuing. "Edward, my son, you are my greatest pride. But I fear that life has hardened your heart. Remember the boy you were, full of dreams and affection. Don't let work and worries steal what is most precious. Time with your family, with your father." Philip swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words. "You two share more than you imagine. The same determination, the same sense of duty, the same deep love that sometimes remains hidden under layers of silence. I ask only one thing. Don't give up on each other. Family is the only treasure worth accumulating in this life." The recorder emitted a soft click when the tape ended. The silence that followed was dense, loaded with unspoken emotions. Thomas wiped away his tears with the back of his hand, suddenly seeming more fragile, more human. "Your grandmother always knew what to say," he finally murmured, "even when she was no longer here." Philip hugged his grandfather, a gesture he hadn't made in years. He felt the fragile bones beneath the thin fabric of the shirt, the irregular breathing, the heart beating strongly. "Grandpa, I think Dad needs to hear this too." Thomas nodded slowly. "Perhaps it's time for some truths to come to light." The next morning, Philip invited his father for coffee. Edward found the invitation strange but accepted. They met at a coffee shop near Thomas's house. "What is it, son?" "Any problem?" asked Edward, direct as always. Philip hesitated. How to explain everything he had discovered in recent weeks? How to translate into words the transformation he felt inside himself? "Dad, I found something at Grandpa's house. Something. Grandma left for you and him." Edward's expression changed subtly. A shadow of vulnerability passed through his always controlled eyes. "What is it?" "A recording. Grandma left a message for you both before she left." Edward was silent, his fingers nervously drumming on the table. "I don't know if I want to hear this, Philip. Please, Dad, it's important. After coffee, they went together to Thomas's house. The elderly man received them with a serene expression, as if he had been expecting this moment. The three sat in the living room, the recorder between them like a bridge over troubled waters. Emily's voice again filled the environment. Edward closed his eyes, his face contracted in an expression of contained pain. When the recording ended, he remained motionless, as if fearing that any movement could break something inside him. "I'm sorry, Dad," he finally said, his voice low and choked. "I should have been more present. I should have taken better care of you after Mum was gone." Thomas extended his hand, touching his son's arm. "We all make mistakes, Edward." "Mine were bigger," insisted Edward. "There's something I need to confess." Philip made a motion to get up, giving privacy to the two, but Edward asked him to stay. "You need to hear this too, son, so you don't repeat my mistakes." Edward took a deep breath, gathering courage. "Dad, 8 years ago, when the company I worked for went bankrupt, I faced serious financial difficulties. I had just bought the house, the payments were high, George needed braces." Thomas listened in silence, his attentive eyes fixed on his son. "One day I found Mum's savings card in your office. I knew the PIN because she had told me once in case of emergency. I borrowed, or rather I diverted a sum to cover my debts. I planned to replace it soon, but things only got worse." Philip felt his stomach sink. He had never imagined his father carried such a secret. "It was the money your mother saved for years for emergencies," continued Thomas, his voice low but firm. "She economized on everything, thinking of protecting us from unforeseen events." "I know," Edward lowered his head. "That's why I distanced myself. The shame. I couldn't look into your eyes knowing what I had done. It was easier to keep a distance, to treat you as if you were just a confused old man who needed to be tolerated. The guilt was eating me up inside." Thomas was silent for a long moment, processing the confession. Philip watched the two, feeling the weight of that moment. "The money was never the problem, Edward," Thomas finally said. "I realized what had happened. I'm not a fool. What hurt me was the distance, being treated like a burden by the one I loved most in this life." Edward couldn't contain the tears that now ran freely down his face. "Can I fix this, Dad? Can we start over?" Thomas smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "We can always start over, son. But this time, with truth between us." The three remained silent for a few minutes, each absorbing the meaning of that moment. Philip felt that something fundamental had transformed in the family dynamic. An old wound was beginning to heal. When Edward left, Philip stayed a little longer with his grandfather. He found him contemplating an old photograph of Emily. "She would be happy to see you talking again," Philip commented. Thomas nodded. "Your grandmother always believed that no problem is too big to be solved with honesty. She was a wise woman." The next day dawned with a different clarity. Thomas woke up early, as always, but there was a new vigor in his movements. He prepared coffee, tidied the house, even cut some roses from the garden to place on the living room table, a habit he had abandoned since Emily passed away. The doorbell rang around 10 in the morning. Opening the door, Thomas was surprised to see a young woman standing there. She must have been about 35, dark hair, deep eyes that seemed strangely familiar. "Can I help you?" he asked, intrigued. The woman hesitated, nervous, firmly holding a letter in her hands. "Mr. Thomas Anderson?" "Yes, that's me." She took a deep breath before continuing. "My name is Lucy Matthews. I'm Helen Matthews' daughter." The name hit Thomas like lightning. Helen, a name he hadn't heard in decades from a past he thought was buried. "Helen," he murmured, feeling his mouth suddenly dry. "Yes," confirmed Lucy. "My mother asked me to deliver this letter personally. She's very ill now and wanted you to know the truth before it was too late." With trembling hands, Thomas took the envelope. He invited Lucy in, offered her coffee, trying to buy time while his heart beat erratically. "How long have you known about me?" he finally asked. "Since childhood," Lucy replied simply. "My mother never hid who my biological father was. She always spoke of you with respect, said it was a brief encounter at a difficult time for both of you." Thomas nodded, remembering that night, 36 years ago. Emily was hospitalized, fighting against the first manifestation of the disease that would eventually take her away. He, desperate and vulnerable, found comfort in the arms of Helen, a newly hired nurse at the hospital. It was just one night, a mistake born of fear and loneliness. They never saw each other again after Emily was discharged. "I didn't know," Thomas began, his voice failing. "I never imagined that from that encounter." "I know," Lucy gently interrupted. "My mother never wanted to interfere in your family life. She raised me alone, with much love. We never lacked for anything." Thomas looked at the woman before him, searching for his traits in that face. He recognized the shape of the eyes, the discreet smile, the way of slightly tilting her head when speaking. It was undeniable. Lucy was his daughter. "Why now?" he asked, still trying to process that revelation. "As I said, my mother is sick. Terminal cancer. Her last wish was for me to meet you, for us to know each other before it was too late." Thomas carefully opened the letter. Helen's delicate handwriting brought memories of that distant time. The message was simple, direct, without recriminations or demands, just the truth, and a request for forgiveness for having kept the secret for so long. "I always wanted to meet you," continued Lucy. "I grew up hearing stories about the honorable man who was my father, about how that night was a moment of mutual fragility, not an act of recklessness." Thomas felt tears burning his eyes. A daughter. He had another daughter, a part of him that existed in the world without his knowledge. "Do you have a family, Lucy? Children?" She smiled, relaxing a bit. "Yes, I've been married for 10 years. I have an 8-year-old daughter, Claire. She's eager to meet her grandfather." Grandfather. Again that word, now with an expanded, more complex meaning. "I would very much like to meet her, and to visit your mother too, if she allows." Lucy nodded, emotional. "She will be happy. She always said you had the right to choose whether or not you wanted to be part of our lives." At that moment, the living room door opened. Edward entered. He had come to bring some documents Thomas had requested. He stopped abruptly upon seeing the unfamiliar visitor. "Sorry, Dad. I didn't know you had company." Thomas felt the weight of that moment. He knew that Lucy's arrival would change everything again, perhaps even more profoundly than recent events. "Edward, this is Lucy," he introduced, his voice firm despite his nervousness. She is your sister." The silence that followed Thomas's revelation was dense, almost palpable. Edward remained motionless, his face transformed into a rigid mask of shock and incomprehension. His eyes went from Thomas to Lucy, seeking some sign that this was a tasteless joke. "My what?" he finally managed to stammer. Thomas stood up, approaching his son. "Edward, I know this is a shock, but it's true. Lucy is my biological daughter, the result of a brief relationship I had during a very difficult period. When your mother was hospitalized." Edward took a step back, as if his father's words were a physical blow. His face quickly transitioned from shock to anger. "You betrayed my mother while she was sick in the hospital?" he asked, his voice trembling with indignation. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that truth he had carried alone for so long. "It was a moment of weakness, son. Your mother was very ill. The doctors gave no hope. I was desperate, vulnerable." "And that justifies it?" interrupted Edward, raising his voice. "While Mom was fighting for her life, you found comfort in someone else's arms." Lucy, visibly uncomfortable, stood up. "Perhaps I should leave and come back another time." "No," Thomas said firmly. "You are not to blame for anything, Lucy. Please stay." Edward looked at his newly discovered sister with a mixture of resentment and curiosity. The resemblance between her and Thomas was undeniable. The same eyes, the same face shape. "Why now?" asked Edward, repeating without knowing the same question his father had asked minutes before. "Why after so many years?" Lucy explained. Again about her mother's illness, Helen's last wish, the search to close cycles before it was too late. As she spoke, Edward seemed to absorb every word, still trying to process the magnitude of that revelation. "Did my mother know about this?" he suddenly asked. Thomas hesitated. "I'm not sure. We never talked about it. After she recovered from that hospitalization, I decided to bury the past and dedicate myself completely to you two. It was a mistake I never made again." Edward shook his head, incredulous. A lifetime of lies, a childhood built on secrets, and now this. Without saying anything more, he left the house, slamming the door hard. Lucy looked at Thomas, embarrassed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to cause problems." "It's not your fault," Thomas reassured her. "Edward needs time to process all this. Eventually he'll understand." But the weeks that followed proved that acceptance would not come so easily. Edward distanced himself again, stopping his visits to his father, ignoring his calls. Mary, his wife, assumed the role of mediator, occasionally visiting Thomas to ensure he was okay. "He's hurt, Thomas," she explained during one of these visits. "It's not just the betrayal of his mother's memory that wounded him, but discovering that there is a sister he never knew, a part of the family history that was omitted." Thomas nodded, understanding. "I know. I just hope that one day he can forgive." Philip, on the other hand, showed an immediate curiosity about his new aunt. He began visiting Lucy regularly, met little Claire, his newly discovered cousin, and was even introduced to Helen, who was receiving palliative care at home. "It's strange, Grandpa," he commented during one of his visits. "I always thought our family was just the 5 of us after Grandma left. Now suddenly, we're more. And somehow, it seems like this was always missing." Thomas smiled, touched by his grandson's maturity. "Life rarely follows the path we plan, Philip. Sometimes it surprises us with unexpected detours." The tension in the family reached its peak when, during a Sunday lunch at Edward and Mary's house, Philip mentioned that he had visited Lucy the day before. "She's amazing, you know. She's an art professor at the State University. Claire, my cousin, is super intelligent, already reading books quite advanced for her age." Edward dropped his cutlery forcefully onto his plate. "I don't want that subject at my table." "But Dad, why so much resistance? Aunt Lucy is not to blame for anything. She just wants to know her family." "That woman is not your aunt," Edward replied coldly. "She's just the result of your grandfather's mistake." Mary intervened, trying to calm the mood. "Edward, please. Philip is just sharing something that's important to him." "Important? What's important is my mother's memory being disrespected. What's important is that my father, who always presented himself as an example of rectitude, lied to all of us for decades." George, the youngest grandson, who until then had been observing everything in silence, unexpectedly spoke up. "I think what you're doing to Grandpa is unfair," he said, with the frankness typical of teenagers. "First you excluded him from the trip as if he were a nuisance. Now you're judging a mistake he made more than 30 years ago. Everyone makes mistakes, Dad. Even you." George's comment left Edward speechless. The rest of lunch proceeded in an uncomfortable silence. A few weeks later, Philip had an idea. As a pedagogy student, he was interning at a local elementary school that was organizing a community art project. They needed someone to create a mural in the main courtyard. "Aunt Lucy," he called. Excitedly, "The school where I'm interning is looking for an artist for a mural. I thought of you. It would be a perfect opportunity to showcase your work." Lucy hesitated. "I don't know, Philip. Your family is still getting used to my existence. I don't want to cause more problems." "Please. It'll be amazing. You can paint. Something about family, about connections that transcend time." Given her nephew's enthusiasm, Lucy ended up accepting. During the following weeks, she worked on the mural, using as a base the stories Thomas had told her about Emily. Without ever having met the woman who was her father's wife, Lucy created an artistic interpretation based only on descriptions. The result was extraordinary. The mural depicted a majestic tree whose roots intertwined to form faces, those of Thomas, Emily, Edward, the grandchildren, and at the extremities, more subtly, Lucy, Helen, and Claire. The vibrant colors conveyed a sense of continuity, of deep connection that overcame distances and misunderstandings. On the day of the mural's unveiling, Philip invited the whole family. To his surprise, everyone attended, even Edward, though he remained distant, observing everything with an indecipherable expression. When the cloth covering the work was removed, a murmur of admiration ran through the audience. The artistic representation of Emily, in particular, captured an essence that went beyond physical appearance. There was a luminosity, an almost palpable presence. Mary was the first to approach Lucy after the ceremony. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "You never met my mother-in-law, but somehow you managed to capture exactly how she was." Lucy smiled, moved. "I heard so many stories from Dad and Philip. I felt as if I knew her somehow." Edward remained distant, but his gaze did not stray from the mural, especially from the image of his mother. There was something different in his expression, no longer anger or resentment, but a kind of reluctant understanding. In the days that followed, a subtle transformation began to occur. Mary invited Lucy for coffee, wanting to get to know her sister-in-law better. George asked for her help with a school art project. Small gestures of approximation multiplied, building bridges over the abyss that the initial revelation had created. Thomas observed everything, with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. The family he thought was crumbling was, in fact, rebuilding itself in a new, more inclusive way. One afternoon, Edward unexpectedly appeared at his father's house. He came with tools and construction materials. "I came to start the garage renovation," he announced without much ceremony. "You always wanted to transform it into a studio for your paintings, right? I think it's time." Thomas was speechless, surprised by the gesture. For years he had mentioned this desire, but never had the courage or energy to start the project. "Thank you, son," was all he could say, emotion making it difficult to speak more. Edward nodded, a small smile breaking his usually serious expression. "Philip will help me on the weekend, and George wants to participate too." Work on the garage began that same day. Edward, always methodical, started by removing the old shelves and boxes accumulated over the years. Thomas watched, offering occasional help, but mainly enjoying his son's presence, the small conversations that naturally arose during the work. On the third day of renovation, while removing an old built-in cabinet, Edward made a surprising discovery. A small secret compartment skillfully hidden in the wall was revealed when part of the paneling gave way. "Dad, come see this," he called, intrigued. Thomas approached, as surprised as his son. Inside the compartment was a carved wooden box, protected from time and moisture. On the lid, Emily's initials. "It's your mother's," murmured Thomas, taking the box carefully. "I never knew of its existence." Together, they took the box to the living room. Thomas opened it with reverence, like someone unveiling a sacred treasure. Inside, meticulously organized, were letters, notes, small objects apparently without material value, but clearly loaded with emotional significance. "They're mementos," explained Thomas, running his fingers over an old movie ticket, an embroidered handkerchief, a dried flower pressed between two sheets of paper. "Your mother was always sentimental, kept souvenirs of special moments." Edward picked up an envelope that seemed newer than the others. It was addressed to Thomas, dated just 2 weeks before Emily's passing. With a questioning look at his father, he opened the envelope after receiving consent. Emily's handwriting, though shaky due to illness, was unmistakable. Edward began to read aloud. "My dear Thomas, if you are reading this letter, it means you have found my little treasure of memories. There is something I need to confess before I leave. I know about Helen. I know about your daughter." Thomas felt the blood freeze in his veins. Edward stopped reading, looking at his father with astonishment. "Continue," asked Thomas, his voice almost inaudible. "I discovered by chance years ago, when Helen came to work at the same hospital where I was receiving treatment. I recognized her look at you, the way she spoke your name. A nurse friend confirmed my suspicions. At first I felt anger, betrayal, but with time I understood. You were alone, desperate, believing you would lose me. It wasn't love that you felt for her. It was fear of loneliness. It was searching for comfort in a moment of despair." Edward paused, visibly moved. "I chose silence not out of omission, but out of compassion. I didn't want you to carry this additional weight, didn't want our son to grow up resentful of the father he so admired. But now that I am leaving, I feel I must release you from this secret. If one day you meet again, if your daughter wants to know you, allow yourself this reconciliation. The forgiveness I offer is not a favor. It is a recognition of our shared humanity, with all its imperfections. The last words of the letter were a simple but profound declaration. I loved you with all your faults, just as you loved me with mine. That is the true meaning of a shared life. When Edward finished reading, the silence that settled in the room was different from all the previous ones. It wasn't a silence of embarrassment or anger, but of understanding, of acceptance. Thomas cried silently, feeling a weight of decades finally being removed from his shoulders. Your mother was always better than I deserved. Edward carefully folded the letter and returned it to the box. His eyes, when they met his father's, were free of the resentment that had obscured them in recent weeks. I think I have a visit to make, he said simply. That same night, Edward went to Lucy's house. The conversation wasn't easy. There were many years of absence to compensate for, many conflicting emotions. But it was an honest beginning. I don't know if we'll ever be like siblings who grew up together, Edward admitted, but I would like to try to build some kind of relationship for the memory of my mother, who had the greatness to forgive, and for my father, who deserves peace in the years he has left. Lucy, with tears in her eyes, extended her hand to her newly found brother. It's more than I ever expected. The reconciliation between the siblings wasn't immediate, but it was genuine. Gradually, Lucy began to be integrated into the family routine. Sunday dinners came to include her occasionally. Claire became a constant presence in her cousins' house. Thomas observed this transformation with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. Life, which had seemed to be coming to an end when he was excluded from the family trip, now gained new contours, more vibrant colors, unexpected possibilities. One afternoon, while painting in his new studio, he received a visit from George, his youngest grandson, who until then had remained somewhat distant from the whole situation. "Can I stay here with you for a while, Grandpa?" he asked timidly. "Of course, my son. Always." George sat in silence, watching his grandfather work. After some time, he asked a question that caught Thomas by surprise. "Do you think Grandma would be mad at me for liking Aunt Lucy?" Thomas put down his brush, touched by the innocence of the question. "No, George. Your grandmother would have been the first to welcome Lucy with open arms. She had a huge heart, you know." George nodded, thoughtful. "Dad said the same thing. He said Grandma was the most generous person he ever knew." Thomas smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Your father is right." 3. Months passed since the discovery of Emily's letter. Thomas's house, previously silent and immersed in static memories, now pulsed with new energy. The studio in the renovated garage had become his favorite refuge, where he spent hours painting landscapes inspired by the stories he told his grandchildren. On a Sunday afternoon, as the family gathered for the traditional lunch, now held alternately at Thomas's house and Edward's, the phone rang. It was Richard, the old work colleague who had helped cancel the reservations for the trip, an event that seemed to have occurred in another life. "Thomas, my friend, how's life?" "Better than I could imagine, Richard. And you?" "I'm passing through town. I'd like to visit you if possible. I have something to tell you." Thomas invited his friend to join the family lunch. Richard arrived punctually, bringing wine and sweets for the young ones. During the meal, he observed with interest the dynamics of the extended family, especially noting the interaction between Thomas and Lucy. After lunch, while Edward and the boys set up the grill for afternoon coffee, Richard pulled Thomas aside for a private conversation in the studio. "I need to tell you something, my friend, something I've kept for a long time." Thomas sat down, intrigued by the serious tone of his usually good-humored friend. "Remember when you asked me to cancel the trip reservations? That same day I received a curious phone call. A woman wanted information about you." "A woman?" asked Thomas, confused. Yes, Lucy Matthews. She explained she was trying to locate her biological father and had my contact through old records from the hospital where her mother worked. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. Lucy had been looking for me before? Richard nodded. She had been trying to find you for a few years discreetly. When she found out I still maintained contact with you, she asked for information. I didn't reveal anything at the time, respecting your privacy. I just said I would pass along the message, but you never told me anything. I didn't have a chance. Right after came that whole episode of the cancelled trip. You seemed so downcast. I thought it better to wait for the right moment. Then I heard through mutual friends that she had finally found you. Thomas was silent, absorbing the information. So Lucy had been looking for him even before Helen fell ill. It wasn't just the last wish of a dying mother, but the persistent search of a daughter for her origins. Thank you for telling me this, Richard. It makes a difference to know. When they returned to the garden, Thomas observed Lucy chatting animatedly with Mary. Seeing her now, integrated into the family, provoked a different emotion in him, knowing she had searched for him for so long. That night, after everyone left, Thomas sat on the porch, the same place from where he had observed months before the family leaving without him for a trip that never happened. The same porch, the same man, but a completely transformed life. Philip appeared unexpectedly, bringing an envelope. "Grandpa, I forgot to give you this. George wrote it for a school contest. He won first place." Thomas opened the envelope with curiosity. It was an essay titled "The Story of My Grandfather, Who Became a Father Twice." Moved, he read the text, where his youngest grandson described with the sincerity typical of youth how the family had transformed in recent months. "My grandfather Thomas," wrote George, "taught me that family isn't just who is born of the same blood, but who we choose to welcome into our hearts. He became a father twice, once when my father was born, and again when he discovered my Aunt Lucy so many years later. But instead of letting this separate our family, he transformed it into something that united us more." Thomas could barely finish. Reading, his eyes blurred by tears. "George surprises me more every day," he commented, returning the paper to his grandson. Philip smiled. He showed the essay to Dad first. Uncle Edward was so moved that he called Aunt Lucy right away to tell her. In the following weeks, a new ritual was established. On Wednesdays, Helen, now in surprising remission from her disease, would visit Thomas, bringing Lucy and Claire. What began as tense meetings, marked by memories of a complicated past, gradually transformed into pleasant afternoons of reminiscence and reconnection. "I never imagined we would end up like this," commented Helen during one of these visits, watching Claire play in the garden with George, sitting on the same porch, sharing grandchildren. Thomas smiled. "Life has mysterious paths, doesn't? It's so many years trying to hide a mistake, and in the end it was precisely that mistake that brought a new chance for happiness." On one of these afternoons, Edward arrived home from work earlier and found everyone gathered. For the first time, he sat with Helen, talking openly about the past, about Emily, about the lost years. There was no longer resentment in his voice, only acceptance and a genuine desire for understanding. "My mother knew how to choose people," he commented at one point. "If she was able to forgive and understand, who am I to do differently?" Helen, with tears in her eyes, squeezed Edward's hand. "Your mother was an extraordinary woman, even without ever having spoken to her personally. She taught me the greatest lesson of my life, about dignity and silent forgiveness." Thomas's 79th birthday was an occasion for a special celebration. The family decided to organize a surprise party, gathering not just relatives, but also old friends, neighbors, former work colleagues. During the preparations, Edward found another recording among his mother's belongings, this one specifically intended for Thomas on his birthday. He decided to save it for a special moment during the party. The day arrived with clear skies and mild temperature. Thomas was taken out for lunch with Philip, while everyone prepared the house for the surprise. When they returned, the sight of so many beloved people gathered in his honor left the elderly man speechless. At the most emotional moment of the party, Edward asked for everyone's attention. With a voice choked with emotion, he handed his father a small urn. "Dad, for years I kept Mom's ashes with me. It was my selfish way of keeping her just for myself, of punishing you for the distance that I myself created. Today I want to return her to the place where she should have always been, with the man she loved until the last moment." Thomas received the urn with trembling hands, unable to contain his tears. Then Edward handed him the recorder with Emily's last message. "I also found this. It's a gift from her to you." Amid the respectful silence of the guests, Emily's voice filled the environment. "My dear Thomas, if you are hearing this, it's your birthday, and I am no longer there physically. But I want you to know that on each of your birthdays, I celebrate the day the world received the man who gave meaning to my existence. You are my companion, my friend, my safe harbor. Never give up on loving, Thomas, even when you are hurt. Love is the only thing that really matters in the end. I will always love you, in every breath of wind, in every ray of sun that touches your face." There wasn't a dry eye in the room when the recording ended. Thomas, holding the urn to his chest, seemed younger, as if an invisible weight had been removed from his shoulders. The party continued, now with a deeper atmosphere of celebration. Not just of a birthday, but of a rediscovered life, of re-established bonds, of healed wounds. In the months that followed, Lucy's integration into the family routine became complete. Mary and she developed a close friendship, often going out together for coffee or shopping. Claire and George became inseparable, sharing tastes and interests, with the typical complicity of cousins who get along well. Edward, initially the most resistant to the new family configuration, surprisingly became the greatest defender of Lucy's presence at important events. It was he who insisted that she participate in Philip's graduation, seated in the front row along with the other family members. "She's your aunt," he explained simply when Philip expressed surprise at the invitation. "It's right that she be present on such an important day." Thomas's house, once a space of silences and absences, transformed into a family meeting point. Sunday lunches became an unbreakable tradition, bringing together 3 generations around the table. On one such occasion, almost a year after the trip that never happened, Edward stood up with glass in hand, asking for everyone's attention. "I want to propose a toast," he announced, looking directly at his father. "To Thomas Anderson, who taught us that it's never too late to start over, to forgive, to expand the concept of family." Lucy was the first to raise her glass. "To the man who gave me life twice, at birth and when he welcomed me so many years later." Philip raised his glass. "To the best grandfather anyone could have, who taught me that true love transcends mistakes and time." One by one, everyone offered their words of affection and recognition. Thomas moved, observed that gathered family, not just of blood, but of choice and acceptance. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up with the serene dignity that had always characterized him. "I thank you for your words, but the merit is not mine. Each of you in your own way chose the path of forgiveness, of understanding, of starting over. When I was excluded from that trip, I thought my time of belonging had ended. Today I see it was just beginning." He looked at Edward, at Lucy, at his grandchildren, at Helen, at Mary. In each face, he saw a piece of the life he had built, of the choices he had made, good and bad. Emily always said that time erases nothing. It only prepares the ground for love to grow in ways we don't imagine. She was right, as always. Months turned into seasons, seasons into years. Thomas continued painting in his studio, telling stories to his grandchildren and little Claire, celebrating birthdays and special dates with the extended family that fate had granted him. The porch from where he had observed the family leaving without him on that distant day became his favorite place to contemplate the movement of the now always full house. The silence that once hurt had transformed into comforting company in moments of reflection. The absence had turned into a constant, emotional presence. On an autumn afternoon, as he watched the leaves falling in the garden, Thomas smiled to himself. The house hadn't been renovated just in its walls, with the new garage transformed into a studio. It had been renovated mainly in the hearts that inhabited it. Time, far from erasing, had only prepared the ground for love to return, more mature, more quiet, but whole. And that, concluded Thomas as he closed his eyes to enjoy the warm sun on his face, was the true meaning of home. Dear listeners, we hope that Thomas Anderson's journey has touched your hearts. Second chances don't always come announced. Sometimes they appear disguised as challenges, painful revelations, long-hidden truths. To continue being moved by stories that explore the complexities of family relationships, we've prepared a special playlist with equally touching narratives. Find it here by clicking to your left. If this story about forgiveness, new beginnings, and unconditional love touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on this video. Each day we bring unique stories that remind us of the fragile and powerful beauty of human connections. What would you do in Thomas's place? Or Edward's? Tell us in the comments. Your opinion is valuable and helps us create content